If anxiety is not just in your head, but in your blood, your glucose, and the raw materials your body is missing, then what else have we been misdiagnosing for years? Because if the body is understocked, then the real question is not what symptom showed up first, it is what was quietly breaking underneath it. And once you see that, the whole wellness industry starts looking less like science and more like guesswork. So, let's get into it. Wait, he is basically saying anxiety can be a chemistry problem, not just a life problem. That is a pretty wild reset for how people think about mental health. But I also hear the alarm bells because people love one clean answer. Human beings will turn one vitamin into a whole religion if you let them. The interesting part is the data argument, not the supplement hype. He keeps coming back to missing raw materials, like the body is understocked, which is a less glamorous explanation than trauma, but maybe more useful. The tree analogy actually lands, though, because you do not treat the leaf only. You test the soil, fix the soil, and then the leaf stops panicking. That is such a brutally unsexy way to describe modern wellness. Yet it makes sense why people keep bouncing between symptoms. They are taking random supplements like they are playing health roulette. NMN, resveratrol, CoQ10, ashwagandha, and a little hope. That is not a protocol, that is a shopping cart with anxiety. But the stronger point is that most people have no baseline data at all. We know our revenue, our team size, our growth rate, and nothing about our bodies. That is honestly insane when you say it out loud. So the first layer is glycemic profile, hormones, and basic nutrients. Glucose, A1C, and insulin tell you a lot more than people think. And insulin resistance is basically the silent chaos before the crash. What I liked is how he tied it to triglycerides and cardiovascular risk. One marker can drag the whole system downhill. Still, people hear blood sugar and immediately think only of desserts. As if white bread is somehow spiritually innocent. Exactly, the pasta is acting like a responsible adult, apparently. The methylation piece is where it gets more controversial for me. Because now he is talking about gene mutations and lifelong conversion issues. And once people hear MTHFR, half the internet starts self-diagnosing. The gene got such a bad reputation it sounds like a villain in a movie. It really does sound like it should be smoking a cigarette in a trench coat. But his point is more modest than the internet makes it. If you cannot convert things efficiently, then the body may need support. That is different from saying genes decide your fate. Which is where I think people either oversell or dismiss the whole thing. The COMT anxiety explanation was probably the most relatable part. That idea of being body tired but mind awake is painfully familiar to people. And the worst-case scenario loop is real. He is basically saying some people have a predisposition to hold on to catecholamines. So the same life event hits two people completely differently. Which is true, but then the challenge is separating biology from trauma from personality. And honestly, he was not saying trauma does not matter. He was saying sometimes the trigger is not the whole story. Which is annoying because everyone wants a single villain. People want one demon, one supplement, one therapist, one fix. The hormone section is probably where most men tune back in. DHEA, SHBG, free testosterone, that is a very different conversation from bro science. It is less, take more testosterone, and more, why is your body not making it? That distinction matters a lot. Same with vitamin D3, B12, magnesium, potassium. These are not exotic ideas, they are just neglected ones. And because they are basic, people assume they cannot be important enough. But basic is sometimes exactly the point. The vitamin D argument is especially interesting because it is both simple and broad. Sunlight, cholesterol, receptors everywhere, immune function, bone health, all of it. Though whenever somebody calls one nutrient the most important, I get cautious. That is usually when the internet starts building a temple. Yes, then there are 3 podcasts and a water bottle brand. The stronger thesis is that deficiency is undertested and undercorrected. And that can explain symptoms people keep treating as separate problems. Sleep, focus, gut issues, mood, energy, all bundled together. That is also why his anxiety explanation has such reach. If the nervous system is overstimulated, the person experiences it as life stress. But if the biology is off, then telling them to just relax is ridiculous. The modern wellness industry loves saying calm down to uncalm people. That should be printed on a t-shirt and nobody should buy it. I also think his story matters because he came from the mortality side of the system. He saw people as data long before he saw them as patients. That emotional pivot is probably what made him so intense about this. Because once you think, I could have helped, that never really leaves. And it explains why he is so aggressive about testing before guessing. Though I do think the precision issue is real too. If you simplify too much, people start hearing medical certainty where there is only a hypothesis. That is probably the core tension in his work. The ideas are useful, but the claims need discipline, which is hard in a world where everyone wants a miracle in 6 words. Still, I get why people find him compelling. He speaks like somebody trying to rescue people from their own blind spots, and also from the supplement aisle, which frankly needs a rescue too. I think the big takeaway is that health data is the new self-awareness. Not because numbers are magical, but because they stop the guessing. That feels like the bridge between biohacking and actual medicine. Or at least the bridge between vibes and evidence, which is a very necessary bridge right now. We should probably leave it there before we start prescribing sea salt to the planet. Though honestly, the internet would absolutely try that. Next one gets even messier, which is probably why it will be fun. Episode 2 gets into the darker side of the system and what he thinks is being missed. Bro, the wild part is how often people are optimizing podcasts instead of blood work. Like they know their monthly revenue, but not their A1C, which is such a human thing to do, honestly. And that gap is basically his whole argument. He keeps saying the body is missing raw materials, not motivation. That sounds almost too elegant, which makes me suspicious. Yeah, because elegant health claims are usually where the internet goes feral. But the tree analogy is actually strong. If the soil is off, you do not scream at the leaf. Humans, meanwhile, just get told to meditate harder. And drink water like that solved civilization. What he is really attacking is the habit of treating symptoms like the whole story. And the methylation piece is the center of that story for him. That is where the folate, amino acids, and minerals conversation gets interesting. Also, he makes a spinach leaf sound like a superhero origin story. Methylfolate, quiet brain, better sleep, boom, spinach wins. The deeper point is that bodies convert things, not just consume them. That conversion step is what he thinks medicine keeps overlooking. Though I do think that is where people get seduced into supplement shopping. The aisle is basically a casino with better branding. That is brutally accurate. His push is more specific, though. Test first, then supplement. That actually feels like the sane version of biohacking, especially when he starts listing the 3 basics: glycemic markers, hormones, and deficiencies. That is the part that feels practical instead of mystical. Glucose, A1C, insulin is a pretty clean starting point. Because insulin is doing way more than people think. He ties it to triglycerides, metabolic syndrome, and fat metabolism. That is a lot of downstream chaos from one upstream problem. But that is kind of the whole systems thinking point. If one biomarker is distorted, the rest start wobbling. And then the internet tells you to just wake up at 5 a.m., which is hilarious if your blood sugar is cooked. The hormone section is where he gets a little more grounded, too. DHEA, SHBG, testosterone, free testosterone, that whole lane. He is basically saying raw material shortages can look like hormone failure, which is provocative because people love a dramatic diagnosis. Nobody wants to hear, you might just be underbuilt chemically. That is a terrible slogan for wellness, but a great insult. The anxiety section is where he really leans into methylation. Fast KOMT, slow KOMT, catecholamines, that whole thing. He is saying some people are not emotionally fragile, they are biochemically overactivated. And that is where I get interested because it refuses to moralize anxiety. It is less what is wrong with you and more what is your system doing. That is a huge shift if you have spent years being told to toughen up. But I also get why people push back because trauma is real too. He is not really denying trauma, he is just refusing to stop there. Which is annoying if you wanted a simple villain. The body never gives you a clean villain, just a messy committee. The vitamin D part is another place where his argument feels unusually mainstream. D3, sunlight, receptors everywhere, immune function, bone health. That is not fringe, that is basically the baseline human operating system. The boldness is in calling it maybe the most important nutrient. He says that like vitamin D pays rent in every cell, which to be fair it might. What I liked is he keeps returning to data instead of vibes. He is almost weirdly anti-random supplementation for a wellness guy. The message is not, take everything. It is find the missing thing. Revolutionary concept, apparently. In wellness, that is basically a manifesto. The life insurance background is the part that makes him feel less polished and more haunted. Because he is not just reading studies, he is talking like someone who saw patterns in people dying. That is a very different emotional source than marketing a supplement stack. And I think that is why he sounds intense when he talks about missed chances. It is not just professional regret, it sounds moral to him. He is carrying a lot of guilt, even when he is being triumphant. That makes the whole human beings on the other side of spreadsheets line hit harder. Because suddenly the data is not abstract anymore. It is somebody's mother, somebody's father, somebody's entire remaining timeline. And then he just casually says he runs 20,000 gene tests a month. That is an insane amount of raw data, which is why his confidence is not coming from nowhere. He is talking about trends he has seen repeatedly, not one miracle case. Still, I would want to know where correlation ends and certainty begins. Same, but that is where his language matters. He keeps saying may, often, and in many cases, which is good. Which is already more disciplined than half the internet. That bar is on the floor, though. I think the real takeaway is that wellness gets stupid when it becomes identity. This version is more interesting because it is about measurement, not mythology. And if the body is running on shortages, no amount of discipline fully fixes that. That is a pretty humbling idea, actually. Yeah, because it means your personality might be partly chemistry. Which is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it is fixable, terrifying because it is measurable. And that is probably why people either love him or hate him. He makes the conversation too concrete for the comfort of vague explanations. Which is rude, honestly, but useful. The big tension is still the same one. Do we treat the downstream chaos or the upstream shortage? And he is very clearly betting on upstream. That is why the episode works, even when you are side-eyeing some of it. Because side-eyeing health advice is basically cardio now. Next episode gets uglier because then the conversation turns to what systems ignore. And that is where the optimism starts getting tested. Episode 2 goes straight into the uncomfortable stuff he says medicine keeps missing. The wild part is how much of this starts with, we just never looked. Like people are treating symptoms with almost zero body data. Meanwhile, their business dashboard is basically NASA level. Heart, career, sleep, all vibes, apparently. And his whole argument is that the body is not random. It is missing raw materials, then yelling about it through symptoms. Which is such a rude way for biology to communicate. But also, annoyingly, kind of elegant. The plant analogy is what makes the point land, I think. You do not diagnose a leaf and ignore the soil. Unless you are the modern wellness internet, then yes, apparently you do. That said, I still hear the alarm bell when someone says one hub explains everything. Because that is where smart people start overreaching. But the premise is not crazy if you keep it tight. Deficiencies can absolutely create a lot of downstream nonsense. The danger is turning that into a religion. Still, I cannot ignore how often he kept saying, get data. That part feels almost aggressively reasonable. Which is probably why it sounds revolutionary. Because the average person has more metrics on their revenue than their liver. That line is brutal but fair. The 3 buckets he keeps coming back to are pretty understandable too. Sugar control, hormones, nutrient deficiencies. That is the most non-sexy wellness trio imaginable. Nobody is posting that on a motivational reel. But it is also exactly why it feels grounded. The glycemic piece especially because people still think prediabetes is just cake. He is saying white bread, white rice, pasta, potatoes, all of it can pile up. Not because the foods are evil, just because the load is too much. And once insulin starts climbing, everything downstream gets messy. That part actually makes sense, even if you strip away the hype. It is very hard to be calm when your system is basically running on emergency mode. The hormone point hit too, because he kept framing hormones as materials, not magic. That is a useful correction for people who think low testosterone just appears out of nowhere. He keeps dragging it back to D3, magnesium, B12, DHEA, SHBG, which sounds like a broken password, but okay. A very jacked password. The methylation part is where it gets more technical and more controversial, but also more interesting because it is not just take vitamins. It is what can your body convert and what can it not. That is a much sharper question. And the MTHFR conversation is always where people start arguing online. Because the internet hears one gene and immediately builds a personality around it. But his actual point is less dramatic than the meme version. He is basically saying some people do not process folate cleanly into the usable form. And that can affect a whole chain of things, including mood and sleep. The folate to methylfolate to homocysteine to methionine pathway is the real center of gravity there. That sentence alone has enough syllables to qualify as a workout. It really does. But the bigger idea is simpler. Chemistry can shape your mental state, which is why the anxiety part was so compelling. He is not saying all anxiety is a nutrient issue. He is saying some of it may be a body that is chemically over-revved. That distinction matters a lot. Because if you have a trauma history, that is a completely different lane. And he does at least make room for that. Which is refreshing because the internet usually chooses one explanation and marries it. For life, very clingy energy. The slow calm T versus fast calm T framing was actually useful. Worrier versus warrior is cheesy, but it sticks. Annoyingly catchy, yes. The core idea is that some people sit higher on the alertness dial, so they do not need a monster in the room to feel tense. Their baseline is already too hot, which honestly explains a lot about some people you and I know. Absolutely. What I found most persuasive was the pattern talk. Same symptoms showing up across different people, same deficiencies underneath. That is at least a testable idea. Even if every single conclusion is not perfect, the method is better than guessing. And the scale, he claims, matters, because 20,000 tests a month is not a tiny anecdote. That is enough volume to see patterns, not just stories. Stories are fun until they start pretending to be laboratories. The high-profile names part is the least interesting thing, honestly. But it does explain why he is visible now. The more interesting shift is that he is clearly trying to move from celebrity wellness to mass education. Which is harder, because mass education is less flattering. You cannot just stand near a celebrity and pretend that is a model. The emotional part near the end was the deepest turn in the conversation. That life insurance work clearly changed the guy. He is carrying real guilt about the people he could not warn. And that explains the intensity, honestly. It stops being a brand and starts being a mission. Still very dramatic, but at least the drama has a spine. The critique part is important too, because he knows he is vulnerable to being oversimplified. And he absolutely will be, by both fans and haters. That is the trap with anyone who talks about root causes. People want a single silver bullet, and they also want a villain. Preferably in a neat podcast clip. Exactly. But this episode works because the central idea is actually practical. Test the basics, fix the basics, stop guessing. That is not glamorous, but it is sane, which makes it almost subversive. And next is where it gets much more uncomfortable. Because once you accept the data gap, you have to ask who benefits from keeping it there. That is the real knife twist. All right, let us leave it there before we start fighting the healthcare system in one sentence. Episode 2 is where this gets way messier and way more interesting. We are getting into what the system misses and why that matters. Because that is where the whole thing starts feeling unfair. Like, wait, you are not sick, you are just missing inputs? That is such a different frame from just chasing symptoms. And it is annoyingly elegant, which is why people resist it. But this is also where people start throwing supplements like confetti, which is the wellness version of panic buying. Exactly, and that is what he keeps warning against. The tree analogy is doing a lot of work here, honestly. Because it is hard to argue with a tree. If the soil is empty, you do not yell at the leaf. Though people absolutely yell at their own bodies like idiots. Right? And then they call it discipline when it is really confusion. What I liked was the idea that the body has a kind of processing line. Raw material in, conversion happens, waste becomes fuel for something else. That is a much more human way to think about biology. Still, the methylation thing can sound a little too neat. That is fair, but neat does not mean fake. It means you finally have a map instead of vibes. Vibes are the unofficial blood test of the internet. Terrible lab, surprisingly popular. The biomarker piece felt like the real center of gravity. Glucose, A1C, insulin, hormones, then the nutrient basics. That is not sexy, but it is probably the adult answer. Nobody wants to hear that their problem is a calendar and a blood panel. They want a lever, a hack, a secret. But blood sugar really is the unglamorous villain here. Because insulin is not just about sugar, it changes the whole energy system. And once triglycerides and inflammation start moving, everything gets messier. Which means people think they are getting older when they are just getting worse data. Exactly. And some of it is fixable before it becomes identity. The anxiety section was the one that really opened the room up, though. Because he is basically saying, not every anxious mind is an emotional mystery. Sometimes it is chemistry, timing, and the body failing to clear the signal. And COMT is the gene that decides how fast some of that signal gets broken down. Fast COMT, slow COMT, warrior, worrier. That nickname is so dramatic it almost makes me trust it less. Science does love a branding problem. But the experience he described is real to a lot of people. Body tired, mind awake, and your brain inventing a disaster at 2 a.m. That does not always look like trauma either. Sometimes it is just a nervous system that never fully comes down. Although we should be careful not to erase psychological causes. Yeah, that is the important pushback. It is not either chemistry or trauma. It can absolutely be both. Which is why simplistic wellness talk drives everybody insane. Because the human body refuses to fit on a slogan. The part about vitamin D3 being so common was also striking, especially with the point about darker skin and lower sunlight conversion. That is one of those things that sounds obvious until you realize how often it is ignored. We built an indoor civilization and acted surprised by the consequences. Bold strategy, terrible outcome. And B12, magnesium, potassium, those are not niche details. They are boring in this way foundations are boring. Nobody posts a reel about concrete, but everybody loves a building. The hormone angle followed the same logic. DHEA and SHBG are not just numbers, they are clues about production. He keeps coming back to raw materials because replacement is less destructive than forcing. That is where I think people hear this and jump to, so hormones are useless. Not useless, just not always first. Sometimes the body needs ingredients before it needs a prescription. And sometimes the prescription is treating a consequence, not the source. That is the uncomfortable part of the whole conversation. The life insurance chapter is where it got weirdly human for me. Because spreadsheets became people once he started reading enough records. That is the moral injury piece nobody expects in a health conversation. He was seeing risk, but also somebody's mother, husband, or daughter, and then being legally blocked from warning them. That would make anyone come out the other side different. You can hear why he is so forceful now. It is not just marketing energy, it is conversion energy. He literally sounds like a man trying to repay a debt to the universe, which is a dangerous type of person to put on a microphone. Because he is not relaxed about it, and that matters. The critique part is where you have to stay honest, though. Like, yes, data matters, but overconfidence is its own disease. And he does sometimes flatten complexity into one clean story. But the core claim is not that everything is methylation. It is that people should not be guessing without basic information. Which is a very unfashionable opinion in a world built on wellness theater. The theater has better lighting, though. The giant point is prevention before pathology hardens. And that is where the missing data problem becomes almost political. Not because every answer is in a lab, but because you cannot fix what you never check. That feels like the real line he is drawing. Do you think people are ready for that level of responsibility? Most people barely want responsibility for their inbox. Fair, but that is exactly why this lands hard. It tells you the body is not a mystery box. It is a neglected system. And neglected systems eventually get loud. All right, let us leave it there before we start prescribing salt to the entire internet. Episode 2 is where this gets even messier and probably more useful. We are getting into what the system misses and why that matters. That missing data problem is the whole story, honestly. People are guessing at their bodies like they're guessing at taxes. And somehow the body gets blamed for being complicated. Wait, what hit you hardest there? The anxiety angle or the deficiency angle? The anxiety part because people want a story, not a mechanism. Right, they want one traumatic event, not a chemistry problem. Which is annoying, because chemistry is usually the bully in the room. And that Chianti stuff is wild because it makes overthinking sound physical. Exactly, it's not just personality, it's how fast you clear the signal. So some people are basically running emotional buffering issues. That's an excellent way to insult the human nervous system. But I do think people hear that and feel weirdly relieved, because being told you're broken is different from being told you're missing parts. Huge difference, and one of those is actually actionable. The test stack he keeps coming back to is kind of brutally simple, though. Glycemic markers, hormones, nutrient levels, then the methylation panel. That is also exactly where people start rolling their eyes, by the way, because it sounds like wellness Hogwarts until the numbers show up. But the numbers are the point, right? Yeah, because without numbers, everyone is just selling vibes in a lab coat. That's the nicest possible insult to half the internet. The insulin piece is also sneaky because people think they are fine if they are not huge. That is the trap, because pre-diabetes hides inside ordinary food habits. White rice, white bread, fruit, all that stuff can still quietly stack up. And then people act shocked when their energy is garbage. The D3 point is the one I keep circling back to because it is so basic. Basic, but massive, especially if you're indoors and under sunlight-deficient living. Humanity really said, let's live under artificial light and call it progress. And then wondered why everyone feels a little spiritually glitchy. What I liked is that he did not jump straight to exotic supplements. No, he kept dragging it back to minerals, amino acids, and basics. Which is funny because the market loves the sexy stuff more than the useful stuff. Of course it does. Basic solutions don't make good Instagram reels. The human angle got me too with the life insurance work. That part is dark because he is literally saying spreadsheets turned into people. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. That blind people walking into traffic line was brutal, man. But it explains the intensity because this is moral for him now. Do you buy the bigger claim that so much disease is deficiency first? I buy that it is underappreciated, not that it explains everything. Yeah, because if you oversell it, people will throw the whole thing away. That is the real tension, right? The idea can be useful and still need restraint, which is rare on the internet, where every idea arrives wearing a cape. I also liked that he kept saying, measure first, supplement second. That is probably the cleanest part of the whole thing. Rare moment of biohacking discipline we should celebrate. Because otherwise it turns into people collecting pills like trading cards, and then wondering why their nervous system is now a group chat. That's exactly it, total supplement chaos. The best takeaway is probably boring, which means it is probably right. Get the data, fix the obvious gaps, then go looking for the rest. Not glamorous, but neither is feeling awful for years. All right, that feels like the right place to pause. We have enough chaos for one episode, barely. Episode 2 is where the debate gets sharper and the fixes get messier.